Welcome to dinner at the Carter G. Woodson Center, Conversation on Race. Thank all of you for signing up for this event. Lunch was wonderful. We're sure tonight will be even better. But before I introduce our moderator for tonight, I'd like to also introduce members of the Berea Human Rights Commission who are co-sponsors of the dinner. Would you please stand? They have been wonderful partners for us, and we look forward to strengthening that relationship. So part two of our conversation tonight will be moderated by our own Dr. Linda Strong-Lee, who is Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Berea College. She is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and General Studies. She received her PhD in English from Michigan State University, and she is currently working on a manuscript on the Mami Wada figure and Caribbean women writers. We're also honored to have her as our Associate Dean, and to welcome, to give this, turn this over to her. I get to sit down now and listen, and she gets to do the work. So welcome, Dr. Lee.
Really missed a wonderful discussion, and I'm looking forward to continuing that tonight. Belle Woods is Distinguished Professor of Residence in African Studies at Berea College. Born Gloria G. Watkins in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, she has chosen the lowercase pen name Belle Woods based on the names of her mother and grandmother to emphasize the importance of the substance of her writing as opposed to who she is. She is the author of over 30 books, many of which have focused on issues of social class, race, and gender. Her latest book is entitled Writing Beyond Race. Thank you very much. Writing Beyond Race, Living Theory and Practice. John A. Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the Executive Director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for change in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. A professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Powell holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. His latest book is entitled Racing to Justice, and many of us in this room have read that book this year. So I just wanted to talk a little bit, especially for those of you who are not here this morning, about the discussion this morning, and try to give a few suggestions for our continued discussion tonight. So one of the things that we talked quite a bit about today was the whole idea of what Bell calls imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and how this, how these different modes affect people, white people as well as people of color. John talked quite a bit about the emergence of Asia as a world power. And so a lot of times we think very specifically about the West, and especially whiteness in the West, as the only frame and the only reference of power. And John really pushed us on that to think about, the fact that most of the people in the world, 1/3 of the people in the world, more than 60% of the people in the world are actually Asian. And so it's interesting that we are still really married to the whole idea of white supremacy. But Bell, of course, pushed back on that. And talked also about how, even the Chinese, in a sense, who are the majority of people in the world, are also invested in white supremacy. And how does that play out, and how does that come to be in the rest of the world? So it was really an interesting exchange. We ended on the whole idea of wounding, and I told Bill that I really felt sort of left hanging at that space and in that place when we're talking about that, and how imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy wounds people. And especially people of color, and in this nation, especially African Americans, because, you know, we have been told for the majority of our lives in this country that we were not even fully human. And so, you know, how do we then deal with those wounds? And how do we take those wounds and heal ourselves? And how do we heal society? So I wanted, I asked Bill to talk a little bit about that tonight. And then I was hoping that we could end not on woundedness, which is not a great place to end, but in the very beginning of the talk, Bill gave her definition of justice, and it was connected to love. And so, and John's book actually ends talking about love and justice. And so I was hoping that we could end talking about love and how justice really has to take place within a space of love. So, over to John.
Somebody stand. Otherwise I can't have enough power. Now, is my mic working?
Testing.
I'm already taking my power. My mic doesn't work.
No,
It's not working anymore.
we need to share the power, not power.
That trained as well. So we believe in shared power mutuality, not power over. The wave of the future.
Yes. So, good afternoon. So let me take up the question first of woundedness. I think it's actually quite profound. Bill talked a little bit this afternoon about trauma. There's a lot of trauma in our society, and we actually want to heal, we want to not be wounded. What I want to suggest is, while there's a specific project around addressing woundedness, that we shouldn't underestimate what I call, and I think there's a chapter in my book on called Lessons from Suffering. And when you go to almost any of the great spiritual traditions, they're animated by suffering. And in our society, which is sort of animated by happiness, yeah, fantasy. You know, when I was a kid, I used to read these fairy tales, and they always ended with, they lived happily ever after. And I said, what's that look like? You know, the book, the end. You know, you figure it out. So what I want to suggest is that there is what I call suffering that just comes from being alive. What I call ontological suffering. There's suffering that actually is embedded in consciousness. And in many ways, the spiritual traditions are actually trying to help us heal that suffering. And in a way, I think oftentimes people who suffer, if they're not crippled by it, if they're not traumatized by it, they actually, I think almost like Maslow had it reversed, right? If Maslow was right, there should be a lot of enlightened people in New York and in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley. Actually, I live in San Francisco. They're not there. So Jesus, right? He was born in an animal trough where they feed animals in a stable. He was suffering. So part of the thing is, if we want to really heal, I think the healing is inherently spiritual. That as long as we don't actually have a spiritual grounding, we will actually be in unproductive suffering instead of a deepening suffering. If you think about death, I buried two brothers. I buried my mother. I watched my kids and I watched myself. And life is full of disappointments and suffering, and especially if we don't have the spiritual growth. We're sort of watching this thing come to an end. We call life. I asked my dad one time, who's a Christian minister. I said, "What is sin?" He said, "Sin is separation. Separation from God and separation from each other." And so in a sense, you could say our spiritual journey is to heal that separation. That separation, if you're a theist, from God, if you're not, from whatever you hold as the universe, the deeper in yourself, and each other. And I'll just stop by saying, what I believe the heart of what we call whiteness, or what I call the Enlightenment Project, is about celebrating, exaggerating, legitimizing, canonizing separation.
Well, exactly. I was going to say that that's what white supremacy does. Because I think about black people prior to Reconstruction and modernity, the sense of feeling like, you know, there's a world beyond humans, and that we draw power from that world of spirituality and strength. You know, when Sojourner Truth says, when I cried out with the mother's grief, none but Jesus heard. But there was such a sense of resistance struggle coming out of spirituality. But once you bring liberal individualism in within a context of white supremacy, you have more African American people, more black people in the diaspora embracing victimhood. That's something we talked about earlier, so that the victim is not going to be in resistance. The victim is going to move towards despair, and in many cases in our culture, addiction to solace despair. So that in many ways, spirituality then stands as a way out of white supremacy. True spirituality.
I would agree with you. I would go carry just a little bit further. It's not just the victim. It's also the hero. In the narrative, in the European narrative, John Wayne doesn't perceive himself as a victim. But in the movies, you never saw him kiss anyone. You never saw him take a pee. All he did was roll the town, shout it up and up. Right? He was the Hobbesian character in the West. But he is also disassociated from himself. He's also disassociated from life. And this is the part that's particularly important. So as people, all people in the United States, I would say, and less so in Europe, as well, including black people and people of color, we hold up the hero as being this disassociated, independent, freestanding individual. So we have the victim, but even our hero in the West is by himself. And it usually is a him. And so I'm saying both of them, both the hero and the victim in the Western story is actually disassociated. Can't be in relationship. And if you think about the right wings, real angst, it's about being in relationship. The thing they hate about Social Security is it's social. Go ahead.
Well, earlier I gave my impassioned rediscussion of John Fee and his very revolutionary liberation theology, which I made a distinction between that and fascist Christianity, because they're not the same thing. That his sort of revolutionary vision of unity between people, people who are different, is what we are working here at Berea to try to get back to and fully realize. Because that vision has been betrayed here at Berea. As I said earlier, it was betrayed the moment Berea didn't stand up for those black folks and chose to respond to the fascist Christianity that said, we need to shut Berea down, we need to shut down the utopia, all of that. And so in many ways, we've been trying to work our way back from that betrayal, because that was the betrayal of anti-racism by white supremacy, and it did indeed create estrangement. And we are still suffering, Berea, from that estrangement. Our college is suffering from that estrangement, that sense of betrayal of the quest. And the quest, of course, was a quest for a beloved community. That's what we should have here. We've got all the foundations for it. So we have to challenge ourselves. What's keeping us from it? And white supremacy is one of those things that's keeping us from it. And I want to say that I said earlier, white supremacy is not a white thing. That black folks and people of color are just as involved in white supremacy. I was like, when we hold Beyonce and her blonde dresses up, that's the epitome of beauty in our society. As black people, people of color, we are once again reaffirming the aesthetics of white supremacy. And I pointed out that Lorraine Hansberry said, this is the one thing that should discredit us in the eyes of our children, that we have not altered the color cast. I mean, the color cast has been so stable, you know, so impinging on all our senses of self and identity. And John has really talked earlier a lot about the shifting nature of identity. Can you say a little bit more about that, John?
So we know that identity and the self, I mean, it's actually quite interesting when you look at it, because the mark of self and the concept of whiteness came together at the same time. It's a European project. It's the Enlightenment project. So both the sense of the self and the sense of whiteness are born at the same time, especially in the United States. We have a more extreme notion of both whiteness and the self itself. And that's because in the United States, the two parents that gave birth to the American sense of whiteness was the European experiment, project, and slavery. So whiteness was defined in opposition to blackness. And blackness was infinite other. Of course, we know there's no infinite other. As James Baldwin reminds us, blackness was already in whiteness. It was already in whiteness. And if you look at early definitions of whiteness, it's defined negatively, not black. And so this sort of dance, complicated dance, has been going on forever. Not forever, a few hundred years, not forever. It's constantly being changed and contested and recontested. And we increasingly say that race is socially constructed. But we don't talk about how it's constructed. And anything that's socially constructed is always in motion, it's dynamic, it's never stable. And our identities are then contingent on the relationships and contestations and aspirations that we have. Our identities are always in relationship to each other. So think about the United States. Marcus Garvey. People didn't like Marcus Garvey. He was like, you can take the white stuff and, you know, I'm going back to Africa. It's like, we hate Marcus Garvey, we hate Marcus Garvey. He said, yeah, I'm leaving. He said, you can't leave. We hate you, but you can't leave. We need you here to hate you. It doesn't work for us to hate you in Africa. So they locked him up. They did not, and they eventually agreed that these were trumped up charges. But this is a powerful relationship between the concept of whiteness and the concept of blackness. And that dance, so we used to call ourselves color. We used to call ourselves Negro. And then once we start saying African Americans, white people say, well, you're going to be African American, I'm going to be European American. We changed the way we thought of ourselves, and it affected the way white people thought of themselves. And it's this constant, powerful relationship. And the relationship, we are in relationship. That's good. The question, Hobbes doesn't agree with that, but Hobbes is wrong. King, think about King. He says we're in a current of mutuality. But we're constantly what affects any of us indirectly, affects it directly, affects all of us indirectly. Now to Baldwin. Baldwin says we're hopelessly and forever a part of each other. And in the end, I cite him in my book, and he says at the end, some of my countrymen find this inconvenient and even unfair. He says, at times, so do I, but none of us can do anything about it. And I always like to cite King and Baldwin together, because King sort of states it almost like an aspiration. You know, we're mutuality. Baldwin says, we're connected, but we don't always like it. In fact, we think it's unfair. We don't want to be connected. That's what segregation is about. It's denying our connectivity. So I think that, in a sense, I've said to my students, and only half jest, that in a really just world, no one would have to live their entire life as a white person.
For me, the king is the great prophet who foresaw the coming fascism and the coming fascism that is tied to white supremacy. I mean, he was one of the first people that said, at the end of the day, white people will choose white supremacy over notions of democracy and equality. And I think that's the struggle. I mean, we talked earlier about the Tea Party, and I think that's the heartbreak of the U.S. That at the end of the day, people would rather have a fascism that allows for the tyranny of whiteness rather than the unity of democracy and equality. While John is responding to that, I want to find some of King's actual words about it because he was so prescient.
Well, I think King was right, but let me unpack that for us a little bit and complicate it also a little bit. And I said this earlier, that as race is changing. Race is going to change radically and very quickly, and in ways that will surprise us. It's already there. I gave the data earlier that 15% of Americans marry someone outside of their racial ethnic group today, and in 10 years it's projected that that will be 25%. 25%, and then will accelerate. And that's all kinds of huge, right? Which was unthinkable. 40% of Americans over 60 have someone in their family of a different racial ethnic group, and in 10 years it will be 60%. Now, I don't know what that means, but it means something. And it's happening very fast. So we like the king, though. Two things about that. First of all, remember that when the elite constructed whiteness, it took 100 years, they did not consider themselves white. Whiteness was the middle strata. And the role of whites was allegiance to the elites and to patrol and control the non-whites. But the elites were not in that category. And so, Bill, when you talked earlier about Nixon being more comfortable with a person of color who's elite, because it's elite. Or you think of Paul Collins. We think this is a great interracial story. It's actually a story about elites coming together. And so we have to bring elites back into the story. Now, if you think about whiteness, and what I said earlier about the self, when whiteness is threatened, for people who organize their identity consciously and unconsciously around it, it's an ontological threat. And I talk about different categories. There's the political, which we know about power. There's economic, which we spend a lot of time thinking that all things are about money and wealth. And then it's ontological, that's close to the spiritual. And in a sense, what a lot of conservative poor whites are saying is that I cannot give up who I am. I'd rather give up democracy. I'd rather give up money. I'd rather give up power than give up who I am. And all of us would do that. All of us would hold on to our spiritual grounding in favor of anything else. And I think you have to engage them just at that point, that this fight around race ontological, this race and whiteness is an ontological fight. It's not a material fight. It's not saying if you give up your whiteness, you get more stuff. Because none of us will give up ourself in favor of stuff. And they're telling us, we're going to take them seriously, but they're telling us that they are really afraid that they're going to suffer an ontological death. And we haven't responded to them from our perspective. I mean we collectively. We haven't responded to them. It's like, well, get over it. But you can't tell people to give up ontological death. What's the alternative? The alternative, I think, is the vision going forward. That instead of an ontological death, you actually get to be born and reborn for the first time as a human being. That's what we are.
It's interesting because I believe that the elite of today, of course, are the super wealthy, the 800 and some billionaires in our nation. And kind of like, I used to find it interesting that Jim Jones and the different sort of Christian cults never had a problem with diversity. There are always great mixtures of race and whiteness. And one might say that about the elites, that when we go to the rich that I say are destroying the earth, they're quite multicultural. And my point was that, Nixon would rather have sat down with Castro than an ordinary black person from the ghetto any day. Because as an elite,
Or an ordinary white person.
or an ordinary white person. So we have this sense then of the grand puppeteers are the elites who are teaching the white supremacy that is the self that not so many white people fear losing. Who will I be if whiteness is not at the center?
I completely agree. This is Ian Haynes Lopez's book called Dollars of Politics. And he makes the point that the elites, corporations and elites, they're not racist in a classical sense. They don't necessarily have personal animus, but they have a strategic. They're doing stuff strategically. Because it's not enough for them to actually wield the kind of power they want in a democracy. So they have to enlist foot soldiers. And so they use the racial anxiety of foot soldiers to attack the public, to attack the state. Not because, again, not because they hate black people or hate Latinos or hate, it's like we need the whites to feel this anxiety so that they will do the work, and then allows us to have destroyed people, to have unregulated capital, to have imperialism. Because the average white person, black person, Latino, Native American, we don't get anything from the oil in Saudi Arabia or Iraq. Why are we concerned about that? That's the elites battle. But the elites aren't sending their kids over there to die. They're sending our kids over there to die. We're doing their work. So they are puppeteers. And I had the pleasure and displeasure of going to school with Mitt Romney. And I got to know his family very well. How I lived in Salt Lake City. And I can tell you, George Romney, I met George Romney, I met his mother. These were very decent people. These people were struggling. If they were to come to their life today, we could have a conversation with them. They were trying to actually give something new expression to them. And that's the family that Mitt Romney grew up in. So how did he then become who he was? Completely strategic. It's like, I need to be president. So I'll say whatever I have to say and do what I have to do. It's nothing personal.
Well, we can say the same about Obama because he is, I would argue, a member of that elite. And that he too is engaged in major acts of betrayal.
I think that's right. I mean, we saw, right? He threw a lot of people under the bus. And even Clinton. When Clinton was against the death penalty, he came back to Arkansas to preside over the death of someone who had the IQ of a 4-year-old. Rumor has it that Clinton actually cried. Clinton was governor, he couldn't stop it. But he realized to stop it would probably mean he wouldn't be president. And so this person gave his life unwillingly, so Clinton could be president. All strategic. But it's not that Clinton didn't have feelings for the guy. He said, sorry, you gotta get under the bus.
The rise of overt, outspoken white supremacist political groups stands as proof that many white citizens of this nation are willing to embrace injustice, to see democratic ideals lost, to ensure that resurgence of white supremacist power. Again, with prophetic insight, King had warned the nation that this could happen, telling folks, quote, the segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, with reestablishment of naked aggression, and it need be a native form of fascism. The man was prescient.
Well, obviously, he had a profound spiritual realm as well. And one of the things he did in that spiritual realm, is that he insisted that the civil rights movement was both a human rights movement. The beloved community was not a black community, it was everybody. He became, as you know, friends and a sponsor for Thich. He refused to hold this struggle to a particular group. That's interesting in my mind when you think about W.B. Du Bois, who said something very similar to King. And W.B. Du Bois, at the end of life, he turned his back on W.C. Du Bois at the very moment that he said, you can only deal with this problem on a global level. As you know, he was the one who actually wrote the original charter for human rights. And he said it had to include economic rights. Eleanor Roosevelt disagreed, and they kicked him out of the NAACP, moved back around and died brokenhearted. But it was a sense of, this is a global movement that we have to deal with. And at that point, the black community turns back on. The same thing with King, and of course, they were talking about Malcolm.
Well, that's what I was actually going to add, that both of them are assassinated at that moment in their political careers where they begin to have a global analysis and where they begin to say, I've changed my mind about certain things. And so, I mean, I'm always awed by the fact that they were so young, that they were, you know, in their mid to late 30s. And when I think about my own growth here now at 61, I won't tell your age, old man. But you know that they were moving towards the kind of global interfaith, because both of them were moving towards an interfaith sense of spirituality, global awareness of economic distress. That's the moment that they have to be stopped. That white supremacy has to stop them.
And that's the moment we are in now. That's the moment we're at now. And that's the reason, I mean, it's actually very interesting. The old form of white supremacy is going to die. It's already dead. The Enlightenment Project is coming to an end.
Can you tell us what the old form, because I'm not sure I agree with you.
The old form is basically, and I said, I teased this out a little bit in my book, and you know, if we don't get it, they help us get it. Read the book, Who Are We? Written by someone who embraces white supremacy. And he says we're not an immigrant society. We are a settler society. And anyone who comes to this country have to agree with what the settlers values. He said, who are the settlers? And he said the settlers were Anglo-Saxons, not Germans, not Italians, not from Eastern Europe, they're Anglo-Saxon. They are Christians, but not just Christians, they're Protestant. They're English speaking, they're hard-working. And he said, these are the values. And he says, anyone who adheres to these values are welcome. Anyone who do not adhere to these values are not welcome. And he built into that whole concept that we have to sort of dominate the earth and the white man's burden. We didn't call it the white man's burden because the book was just recently written. So the kind of imperialism, both religious imperialism and economic imperialism, was part of the white man's burden. And was part of whiteness, this idea of dominating the other, whether the other being the racial other or the other being the earth. So, so the New York Times, I said, certainly read that article, the headlines was, for the first time in 350 years, we're about to enter an era where the world will not be ruled by a Christian white country. It didn't say this, but it could have said, and you should be scared. So that's the old form of white supremacy. The notion that not just, so whiteness is a kind of performance. And like you said, in terms of blacks can perform white too. We can adhere, but the Chinese are not radical individualists as we are. They're not Christian. Confucianism, all this thing is very grounded in relationships and the earth. So I'm not saying it's better, but I'm saying it's different. Hinduism is not grounded in individualism. It's grounded in a kind of collectivity that most of us don't even begin to understand. So all I'm saying is we're getting these large expressions in the world that we're not going to colonize. We're not going to dominate. They actually have their own sense of what the world, what the cosmology is about. And it's not the European Enlightenment project. It's not the white project. It's something else. And that's actually going to create also great anxiety in the elites and white and European America. And I'll stop after this. Think about Obama saying, we have to change our military presence in the world to shift it to Asia. We have to basically contain China. We're worried about China. We can't control them. They're really scared of China. And I have movies where, I mean, they don't see how to control China, and they can't. And they don't know what to do, because we can't be in a big war with them. You know, they own the bank. So
Tell your story about the foreclosures and.
So in Cleveland, I work on foreclosures around the country. Cleveland was one of the first cities hard hit by foreclosure. Cleveland, 8% black. And when we talk about globalization, it sounds like something abstract way out there. Cleveland couldn't pay its bill. The city was in complete downturn. And so someone sued to actually get the loans modified in Cleveland, because so many loans were underwater. And the law was, if you want to get the loans modified, you have to bring the underlying credit holder into the court. 25% of loans in Cleveland were held by Chinese. Nobody knew that. And the court says, where are these people? I said, we don't know. But they are your creditors. And the case was dismissed. If that's happening in Cleveland, it's happening all across the United States. Globalization is incredibly complicated. It affects our daily lives. It's not something in the future, it's something right now. And you know this, right? The United States, for all of its problems, reduced carbon gas emission in the last 10 years. But the number of emission in the atmosphere increased substantially because China increased its emission substantially. We live in one world, the same world. And I'll stop by saying this. The admiral of the United States Navy said, I think the Pacific Ocean is big enough for us in China. I mean, he's not sure. He's trying to hold back the hawks in the United States who basically say, no, the Pacific Ocean is ours. So that's the white supremacy that we're getting off and under. We're going to have to share.
But where John and I diverge is I say that there's an aesthetics of white supremacy that runs through China, that runs through our world, that it may not be governed by the same elites we're talking about, but aesthetically, it affirms itself in similar ways, the overvaluation of white skin, all of these things. So John is more optimistic than I am in the sense that Asia has a different frame. I feel like it has a different substance, but that the certain aesthetic forms of white supremacy are as present in Africa, Asia, as we are, and they've proven to be harder than anything to change. I mean, why can't we change the color pass? Why can't we expand our notions of what is beautiful to include a diverse sense of things? You know, and why are we, let's say, why are we as black people holding on to what I call an aesthetics of white supremacy?
Well, a few things. Certainly, I guess I'll make two comments. One, I think white supremacy is not just aesthetics. There's also, so I'm saying that if you look at the package in terms of, and it keeps changing, it has to keep changing. If you look at the package, then the package, you start taking out, it can't sustain itself unless there's some material grounding for it as well. It can't sustain itself in this context unless there's a military grounding for it as well. It can't sustain itself unless there's a dominance grounding for it. So I'm saying even the aesthetics of whiteness is going to change. It's changing. About a month ago, maybe 6 months ago, one of the supermodels in the world was from China. And they had a whole thing on, I think, the Times of Newsweek, and they're saying, beautiful woman in China. It's like, really? You found a beautiful woman in China 5 months ago? So part of the white aesthetic doesn't, even if the Chinese are light, doesn't recognize them as beautiful. The Chinese men will tell you, think about sex symbols in America. It's very hard to think of a Chinese man as a sex symbol. So the other thing, though, when I talked about intermarriage that's happening, there is actually a different, a more complicated, a more nuanced sense of beauty, which would not have happened. In fact, in the black community, the fastest growing interracial relationship is happening between black women and white men, which is a little bit on the radar, because historically, that was not the case because of slavery, because of rape, because of sexualization. There's something happening. And 15%, not all that's black and white, but 15% is a lot, 25% is a lot. These are people who are voluntarily who are being attracted to the racial and ethnic other. And as that continues.
And where we differ is, I don't necessarily think that attraction signals an end to white supremacy. I see that in many cases that attraction can come out of white supremacy. You know, I used to make this joke, every white man in America had two women in his life, the white woman he was married to and the black woman of his dreams. So that was a little witty way of saying that within the erotics of racism, and there's an interesting book out of Duke called The Erotics of Racism, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is less racist or less white supremacist because you're willing to bond and even to marry someone of a different race. Oftentimes we want the person of color, that marriage is also then becomes an initiation into whiteness. That identity you're talking about where the person of color ceases to be a person of color.
I think that's true, but I think it's not the whole truth. And two things. So and there's a book on this, right? It's called Coming Immigration, which basically says, so a couple of things. In some ways, you know, my good friend Derek Bell, and as many of you know, died a few years ago, he would posit something, and Derek was brilliant. He was almost as brilliant as my friend standing next to me. Derek would actually say something, and there was no way to disprove it, right? Because he would say something that's like, well, it looks like that is just because it's an aberration. You know, I said, well, how do you recognize an aberration and not an aberration? And what I'm saying is that I think, yes, white supremacy is not dead. And I said earlier, like a black hole, when the sun burns out, it actually burns hotter. So we're going to see a lot of strange expression, but something is changing. And I think if we can't look at those changes, we also can't participate in those changes. So I think something much more profound is happening, and will continue to happen all around the world. And it won't always be good. And so, yes, I think certainly eroticism is not necessarily the same as being married to someone who looks just like you. But as I said earlier, white supremacy to me, first of all, was never simply supreme. We had a system that was white and other. And I said, we forgot the elites. You got to bring the elites back in there. When you bring that in, it becomes much more complicated. And something else is happening in the world. Western Europe and the United States was the heart of white supremacy, and was the heart of white expression around the world. That world is tilted to the east. We don't know what that means, but it does mean something. And it means something, the Chinese have always had their own aesthetics. It's not American aesthetics. They still talk about people being brown eyes. They don't find that necessarily beautiful.
Or they did not. See, I feel that John is not allowing for the amazing impact of Western media on the country of China, because we also know that right now, I'm into cars. But one of the things that's happening in China is the elite there are busy buying big cars for which there are not adequate roads, for which is making it incredibly dangerous for pedestrians and people who ride bicycles. But that elite formation is happening there in China as well.
But the elites have always been in China. And all I'm really saying is, look, I spent some time in China. I'm not an expert in China. But I can tell you, for all the bad roads, they have many more good roads than we do. And they're building them much faster. They have trains that went, I mean, the technology, they've embraced technology. But they've also, right now, I don't want to spend too much time on China, but right now, China is in a major campaign against the elites. If you think about the whole thing with, Mao and the Cultural Revolution, it's much more nuanced. I'm just saying, look, we are used to looking through our frame. And so that's how we're going to look at the world. I'm saying Chinese have a different frame. We have to take it seriously. They have a 6,000-year history. It's not simply an add-on to our frame. It's actually much more complicated. And it's going to influence us as much as we influence them. So what does that really mean? I don't know. It means the way we do, think, and practice race will be different in the future than it has been in the past.
Well, I think that our dissident visionaries like King, and especially in where we go from here, have offered us different frames. But those frames have not taken in any kind of collective way in our nation. I mean, I think King was in tremendous despair about the fact that given community beloved community versus liberal individualism and its worship of materialism, most black people would choose liberal individualism. So that frame that he offered really was no more embraced by us as black people than it was by white people.
I agree entirely, except I'll say this, King is trying to disrupt individualism frame. You know what I'm saying? The Chinese are not trying to disrupt individualism frame. They don't have an individualist frame. And so in China right now, they just recently passed a law for all the young people coming to the city. If you don't go visit your parents, you get fined. Right? We can't imagine that here. Like, what about our freedom? What about,
But where is that coming from? It's an attempt to hold on to values that are anti-liberal individualism. The question is, how strong will that hold be?
Well,
I mean, we have to look at, for example, the role of Disney. Disney is quickly building an empire in China. I think that social media is an interesting place to look for the push for a kind of newfangled white supremacy in what it entices people to. We might even look at, for example, if we think of whiteness, the role of sugar in China and Africa. Places where people didn't have heart attacks. But when sugar comes, people consume. I mean, I am a big fan of a book called How the Rich Are Destroying the Earth by Hervé, Kempf. But he talks about, like, let's look at what are the tools of socialization into the love of whiteness and the worship of whiteness. Because you said it earlier, John, about we cannot divorce from the environmental struggle.
The struggle for social justice. No, I agree with that. So ultimately saying, and I'll leave it at this, because look, here we have a society that has an unbroken history of 7,000 to 8,000 years. Most of that history, whiteness as we know it, didn't even exist. And I'm saying it's a huge mistake for us to try to understand China, India, just through the frame of whiteness. It's like, that's, in a sense, that's our obsession. That's a Western obsession. I'm not saying
what I'm suggesting is an intersectionality, that there is a low-level base of intersectionality where the aesthetics of white supremacy meets, whether we're talking about Japan, China, and that I think that we ignore that at our own risk.
I'm just talking about the aesthetics, because when you went, if you go back to when Columbus did his thing, right? The largest ocean fleet in the world, by far, was in China. They burned it because they did not have a culture of imperialism. They thought they were center of the earth, and so the center of the earth might have included Tibet, but they didn't have an interest of, let's go explore the world and conquer it. That was a Western thing. And all I'm saying is, look, we're talking about...
Tell that to the Tibets today.
Yeah. No, I said that.
China, well...
But I said the world. But
yeah.
So they thought they were the Middle Kingdom. They still think that. But they did not. They had the capacity to do much more harm than Europe, and they chose not to. All I'm saying is that it's like trying to understand when I introduced Buddhism. My parents were Christians. Still are. My father's a Christian minister. And my mom was trying to figure out, what are you doing, right? And so I gave her a book about the Buddha. And she read it, to her credit. And I said, what's that, Mom? She said, well, he seems like a pretty interesting guy. I don't understand why he didn't accept Jesus. And she had a frame, a Christian frame. It didn't matter that he was 500 to 600 years older than Jesus. She had to look at it through that frame. And I'm saying, if we insist on that, when we look at systems in relationship to each other, we miss stuff because we insist upon operating from a particular frame. And I'm saying it's just much, much more complicated. And I'm not saying that frame is gone, I'm not saying it's dead, but it is different. And it's different in ways. I have a friend who actually, a number of friends, but one friend who is part of the elite, he went to live in Asia, and he said he got there, and he's so disappointed. It's like all the stuff that we have in common, blah, blah, you know, they have too. It's like, I traveled 9,000 miles and I ended up back home. And then he said the longer he stayed there, the stranger he got. He realized this was a facade. He said, there is so much stuff going on that I didn't have a clue of looking at McDonald's and big cars. And then he said, after he'd been there for 15 years, he felt like he didn't know anything about the culture. So I'm just saying, we got to take a harder look. But now, right here in the United States, I also think that we're seeing contestation we're seeing people trying to perform whiteness, trying to perform race in a different way. And I want to help that. I want to celebrate that. And so when people are afraid about giving up their ontological self, because that's all we know, can we offer something different? And it's drawing a tradition of King, but also drawing a tradition of whoever. The world is small now, it's not big. And so everybody knows something about everybody else, but not enough.
I have been writing that what we offer to people, I began this essay by saying recently people have been asking me what can we do to end white supremacy? And I say that what is needed is to love justice. To love justice more than our race, our sexuality, our religion. And so that becomes the real issue for me is where do we begin to teach a love of justice? I spoke earlier about how growing up in the segregated schools of Kentucky, I was constantly pushed into these voice of democracy contests where I had to delineate what is democracy? What is it to be a citizen? What does it mean to love justice? Now, King very much said that justice was the outcome of love against non-love. So to me, I believe that we have to have a revolution of values in relationship to how we conceptualize justice. And so if we bring that back to Berea, we're talking about this little college here that was formed from a vision of justice, of how can we create a more just world that allows people of color and white women to come to the table with white men and grow to a spiritual wholeness that will be beyond race, that will transcend race. So that is our project, people. That if we're talking about how to shift Berea College, part of what we have to shift it back to is that liberationist theological project, which was one of spiritual wholeness. And we can talk days about how we moved away from that project. But the question is, how do we go back? And I just want to offer, one of my favorite books is a book by Kathleen and James McGinnis called Parenting for Peace and Justice. And they offer this definition of justice: the progressive realization of people's economic rights, the material necessities of life, cultural rights, their dignity as individuals and as a people or culture, and political rights, their participation in decisions that affect their lives, their being, artisans of their own destiny. By justice, we also mean the progressive realization of people's duty of solidarity, working with others for the common achievement of these rights. I like that definition because of the expansive nature of it, that it's not just a political definition, but it is a definition that returns us to a sense of, John, in your book and my work, what does it take for us to feel spiritually whole? Because what will it take to meet that void that we're saying whiteness exploits within people? That sense of no self.
No, I agree. In fact, I would say that this disease of our society is already built into whiteness. It's not me that's making white people uncomfortable. The very notion of being separate from each other in the world, and therefore dissociated from oneself.
And the environment.
And the environment, exactly. It's already problematic. It's already diseased. It's already, from my perspective, the way that we think about whiteness, not white people, whiteness, is actually anti-spiritual. Because it's denying relationship with everything. And the heart of spirituality is the right relationships with everything. And so I agree with that. And all I'm really saying is that, and this may sound hard or whatever, I think people of all hues and faith, and to different degrees, are struggling to try to figure out what is a healthy community. What kind, and it's not just a psychological problem, it's also how we construct our institutions, how we construct colleges, how we construct It used to be in the 1960s, most porches in the United States were built facing front. As we became more insular, all the porches were built in the back. It's like, so we're pulling further and further in to a place that doesn't exist. And I can say a lot more about this, and I've said more about it, but let me just say that I think, in a sense to me, the spiritual practice is not only having those relationships, but being conscious of them, being able to live, and then to create institutions and structures and values that celebrate. And so I completely agree. And I think that to also offer that, when you think about many stories in the Bible, my brother's keeper, I'm responsible for my brother. Or when Jesus basically says, because you've done some things for me, because when I was hungry, you fed me, because when I was clothed, you clothed me. And they say, when did I do that to you, Jesus? I've never seen you before. Inasmuch as you do it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. So to realize that it's all about this is realized, not just as a political, but as a spiritual. We are each other. And to actually start to celebrate that and claim that, to me, is both beautiful, and that's where the healing of racism, white supremacy, and the spiritual project actually takes place.
Last night and then earlier today, though, I was saying to John, in order to end domination in all its forms, homophobia, sexism, racism, we have to be willing to think outside the box and act outside the box. If all we do is work within the box, the structures remain the same. And that I think has been the hard challenge for institutions, for not just Berea, but many institutions like Berea, because we are structured. There is an order. I was saying earlier, there's not going to be any flood of diversity into Berea. We're not going to have all these new black professors and people of color, progressive people coming to Berea. So we may have some, but not the kind of pushing in that would have transformed. So really we're talking about how do we transform inside what we have. Because it's like Pima Children, Buddhist teacher says, start where you are. That's the ground that we have. We have an amazing foundation. So, okay, what are we doing with that amazing foundation? How are we serving the interests of that Berea College that was about anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-domination? Because I always say, anytime we do the work of love, we're doing the work of anti-domination. So that is the challenge to us, Bereans, both our town and this college. How do we go about, transforming ourselves? I made the joke today that I had lunch with Lyle, and I gave him my list of people I would fire. And I was really impressed with Lyle, because he just sat there and acted like he didn't hear anything I said. I was like, this man is a poker player. We want, at this point, to open things up, to ask questions. Have you asked questions, Janet? Or Janet?
Was my name on the list?
I can't tell you how to do that. I'll be told I'm done today now. Just check.
I guess if you're here, your name probably wasn't on the list. I don't know.
Who has a question? Come on now. Yes.
I think you both spoke movingly about the need for moving back toward the beloved community, but I'm wondering how we can really do that when some of the greatest rights in this country and in the world right now are the rights of billionaires to be billionaires and to exploit us and nature.
Well, actually, I said earlier that the greatest threat to white supremacy is economic struggle. That Occupy Wall Street signaled a shift that many white Americans who had never before thought about class, caste, and economic realities. And I said, when we had on our TV screens white families people got on buses, white people who had lost their jobs, and went to the homes of the super wealthy to protest. And the super wealthy was enraged. And one of the things that many people said, we don't want our children to see this. We don't want our children to hear what is being said about us and what we do in the world. I thought that was tremendously awesome, that interface of revolt and revolution, and then that people were forced to see how far the rich will go to control representation, and even to want to control what their children see. Now, we as black people exercise so little control over what our children see. Now, I know many of you have heard me talk about how I didn't care for 12 years as a slave, and I've been saying it today. If I never see a naked, raped, and beaten black woman again for the rest of my life, I'll be fine. I said, John, of course, Stephen Sweetman, this is, I want to see that dull film about a black woman like myself. All she does is sit around reading and writing. And I said, you go to that film. And I'm just saying that, think about how our representation has not shifted and its impact. And I did say that if I had children, I would want them to see this film, because I don't see any movement. And I just see the reinscription, certainly of the black female male body, as a racialized, sexualized victim. And where does that get us?
So just to add to what your question. So obviously one question, I just went to Thomas Piketty's talk the other night. Some of you know his book called Capital of the 21st Century. It's like a new rage. He's actually pretty interesting. He talks about the growing inequality that's happening. We're going back to the 19th century. And, I feel like he's brilliant. He'll get accolades for being brilliant. But I feel a little bit like the Geico commercial. It's like, everybody knows that, So why is it that we have such a hard time sustaining a movement? The super elite, whether it's 800 or 2,000, not many of them, they can't win one election by themselves. So they have to have foot soldiers. So I think part of the challenge for us, and I think in some ways the challenge, is to speak to this ontological question. After Obama won, I went around talking to people and reading about the Tea Party. People were really scared. They were crying. They were, one of them said she couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. And they took it a step further than we do. We used to say, if a right-wing person wins, I'm going to go to Canada. They said, we want to succeed from the youth. We're not going anywhere. Let's break off. You're crazy enough to vote for Obama, we don't want to be party. But they're telling us something. And I think that to sort of engage around the anxiety that many people with the growing diversity have, is actually the key. And that much of our lessons, which is let's not talk about race, it's too hard. When we talk about race, we talk about black people. It's like, no, this is about America. This is about who we are and who we're going to become. And in a sense, they cannot see themselves in our vision. That's why they hate our vision. They can't imagine what the country would look like if Obama wins, if Hillary wins. They can't imagine. Hillary's not even that radical. Right? But they can't imagine what the world would look like. They can't imagine who they would be. And so I think we have to engage at that level. Say, yeah, I know this is scary for you. Because I was scared if Romney would win. I know Romney. But I'm always talking about cities and countries back that whole thing about Canada.
Well, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about why you think African Americans hold on to color. I mean, what is it? Why can't we let it go?
Well, I think that this goes back to John. Who are we black people without white supremacy? What are our definitions of meaning in our lives? I mean, think about how much, all y'all black people know, we spend a lot of time talking about race and what white people have done and what white people will do. What are we replacing that dialogue with if it's no longer there? I mean, it's like I've been thinking, just in spiritual stuff, I was reading something where the man says, well, what about a person who says, you know, I need $100. If I just had $100, I could make it. And you pull out the $100, but the person keeps saying, if I just had $100, I could make it. They're not taking that $100. That inability to receive your good, which I believe is at the heart of internalized self-hatreds, that even when your good is presented to you, and see, that's the question, what alternatives are we presenting to black people that are different from white supremacy? That say, here is a self over here that will allow you actualization and realization. And people say, no, well, I want to stay over here because I know what to do over here. I don't know what to do when you tell me that I can construct a freedom self, a liberated self. Who will I be in the world? Because I notice that as I go about the world, as if the world exists for me, it's very troubling to people around me. And it's not just troubling to white people, it's troubling to black people. Like, who do you think you are? And someone said to me, who do you think you are, nigga girl? Because I was conversing with whiteness in a way that they felt, how dare you? And these are black people. You're not staying in your place. And you know you're out of your place, tall man.
I experienced that when I went to Europe. People said, you know, you're out of your place. I said, I don't have a place. And the thing, we actually know a lot about your question. We haven't talked about it much today, but we know a lot now about the unconscious. We know how it works a lot more. I'll just give you some numbers. And I'll give you 4 numbers. One of them is 40 bits a second. Hold that number. And this is the I always say this. If anybody can get out 4 of these numbers, you get 2 free books from me and 3 free books from them. So here it goes. 40 bits a second. 11 million bits a second. Those are 2 numbers. There are 2 more. 10 to the 80th power. That's 10 with 8 zeros after it. And 10 to the million power. That's 10 with a million zeros after it. Anyone know what those numbers represent? 5 books on the line. See, you don't have to worry. Neurological connections. So that's one of them, right? So you know what the other 3 are? 40 bits a second is sometimes how many bits your conscious can process in 1 second. 40 bits of information a second. 11 million bits a second is how much your unconscious processes in that same second. 40 versus 11 million. 10 to the 80th power is the number of atoms in the known universe. 10 to the billionth power is the number of connections your brain is capable of making. So what we know in terms of what the knowledge is basically happens. It's connections at the neural level. And so we actually now, with computers, can look at the words we use. How often do we use the word black and whatever, ugly, black, and dangerous, black? Actually, a lot. That affects all of us. We're making neural networks. All of us, not just white people, but all people. We have the same associations, not as strongly as white people, but we have some counter stories that they don't have. And we can actually measure that in people. So one of the things we can do in the Bell stuff in terms of representation, we can have new representations, but we have to have a lot. It's like, what's the relationship between the bell and eating? Now, if you ring the bell, you feed the dog makes a neural connection. All you can do is now ring the bell, the dog starts salivating. We're all dogs, so to speak.
Some of us are bells.
I'm glad you mentioned the foundation of the beloved community because I actually believe that, and I've never lived in a place that had more of a foundation for it than this place. So my question is a rather concrete one. I think all people in this room know what you're speaking about theoretically. You understand that. I think the difficulty is putting it into action. So how can we give us some concrete steps in this community to to get us closer to the destination of beloved community, to make us more radical, more courageous, to make us more inclusive, fill in the blank.
Well, I'm
Gets
gonna
us
give you that
closer
list of
to
people that need to
relevancy.
be fired.
I don't want that
But the story behind that was that part of what has happened to Berea is the bringing into this community so many people who don't share the values, the foundational values. And so a tension arises between those of us who feel committed to the values of this community, and let's say the professors who come here because it's the only job they can get. So, okay, if this is the ground we have to work with, then concretely, Chad, we've got to do more education for critical consciousness on the ground. What was the same is for those students who come here knowing nothing about that foundational history of Berea, but what they know is I won't have to pay tuition. So then they come here almost with a kind of contempt for that foundational history. Well, whose fault is that? You know, someone said to me, this is about our psychological services here at Berea. Well, why would we need people of color counselors? I said, well, if we have white people, counselors and otherwise, who are asking that question, we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job to educate people around what Linda wanted us to talk about, which is the traumas that domination creates in us that are very real, that cannot just be worked through in the classroom. I mean, as much as I'm here because I have a beautiful mind that God has blessed me with, I'm here because I had the good sense to give myself a therapy, starting as an undergraduate, because I knew that there were some things that were so messed up inside me from racialized, sexualized trauma that had to be dealt with. Because one of the biggest myths of our society is that you can succeed and not attend to that interior life. So partially, you might argue that we begin at Berea, Chad, with a spiritual revival. We begin to see whether we can, in fact, convert those people who have come here with no awareness of the mission, but you know, and I joke about the firing list, but that's because I'm a big follower of the relationship expert Gottlieb, who says that once contempt has entered the relationship, that is marriage, love relationship, the relationship is doomed. So I would argue and put on the table, we got too much contempt here at Berea for what Berea stands for, and not enough celebration. So the question would become, I said earlier, forgive me all of you who are busy sitting on these great commitment committees, because I said we don't need another great commitment committee. What we need is a concrete committee that says, let's suss out, what are the concrete steps that we have to take to bring those revolutionary values that are the groundwork that we're all standing on back to the foreground.
That was my question. It was, Chad.
Well, I'm just saying, you said concrete, I'm saying a concrete committee, not to discuss, yet again, the value of the commitment, but a committee that says, here are the steps we have to take. One being, we cannot bring students into this community who have no understanding of what the foundational values of the community are. Because then they become as much a part of that production of a kind of contempt and hostility towards their fellow students. Not empathy, not concern, not beloved community, but, you know, separation. And we've had a lot of separation here. So that's what I'm saying, Chad, that there's a concrete difference in a committee that is sussing out what are the concrete steps we're going to do to change, and a committee that's sitting around discussing the great committees.
So let me just add a little bit. You
Well,
don't have to
go
hear
right
it.
ahead.
So, some of this may seem very difficult, but I would suggest some of it's not, just about the same. So part of it is to have a clear sense of your values and visions that actually then you organize around. And so, you know, if you value something, then you organize your resources and you work around that thing. So for
Can I get you to tell your Stanford story? Because that was one of the moving stories that you told us earlier. Don't you guys think was here earlier? Please.
Stanford was worried about becoming a majority non-white university. And in part, they were worried that the money was going to discipline them in a way that actually was going to punish them, because they assumed that most of the donors were white, and once they saw all these kids running around who were not white, they were not going to donate. And so they actually worried out loud about this problem. And it did become a majority non-white university about 8 or 9 years ago. And almost at the same time, it became the #1 endowed university in the world. And the gap between it and Harvard and the rest of schools keeps widening.
Amen.
It's a little bit
Hallelujah.
complicated. A friend of mine was President Bell's line of years. She talks about democratic America. If we say that we really care about creating a democracy where people can take each other's perspective, that's what we should actually look for when we look for students and professors. So we actually, and then that actually is reflected in the classroom, it's reflected in curriculum. So if we really want to create a certain community, you create things by practicing it. And are we practicing it? It's not, I have a beloved community up here, am I practicing the hard work of relationships? Am I giving credit for it? Are people giving rewards for it? Are people acknowledged for it? Or is that something you do after you finish your teaching, after you finish your video?
Yes, what do people in this room do to heal the wound of estrangement between Berea College and Berea the town? You know, I'm kind of an underground mayor. I've been doing my work of healing that estrangement, of participating in the life of our town, not just in the life of Berea College. Because I think that that is also something that takes us back to our true roots, our true beloved foundation that I don't other myself. But you know, I know how smart I am. But you know, I have a relationship with the car dealers of Berea. Because I can speak many languages. Because that is the other thing, that if we want beloved communities, we can no longer have just one language. And I'm not here saying that I'm talking about being only able to engage in academic speech, having contempt for people who speak our Kentucky vernacular,
Right.
especially if we don't understand them. You know, and how do we work around it? What do you say? I think, come on, Bereans, a lot of Berea College people work around it about let me have nothing to do with the town.
That's right.
And let me turn away
That's right.
from those white folks and colored folks at Walmart who aren't speaking my language.
That's right.
You know, and so these are things where every day Belvins can challenge herself with the question of who do I serve when I go out my door? Who am I going to serve today? You know, if I'm willing to drive, you know, an hour to get some cabbage rather than go to Save-A-Lot, a locally owned business, who am I serving? What is my relationship to the local town in which I live? And we know that that very contempt we're talking about is a big part of how many of us at the college relate to the town. I don't have time to have a relationship with the town. And so those are concrete things. I mean, part of what, if we talk about Buddhism, I was thinking about how much white supremacy has galvanized in a psychoanalytic sense people around desire. And how amazing Buddhism is in its insistence that the core of our suffering is desire. So that in part, in order to discipline ourselves for spiritual growth, we have to deal with the issue of desire. Because that is the thing imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy has most used as a tool of socialization. Desire. You want that car, you want that house, you know I want the car. I mean, I want the car so bad, I gotta go back to therapy. Because it's like, you already have 5 cars, Phil. You know, I fall in love with cars. And I hardly drive. I have serious problems. But I know how to take my problems through. We are ending. Is there somebody with a burning question? Uh-oh, you're burning. I don't know your name. I apologize.
That's fine. My name is Shirley Simmons. What I'm hearing both of you talk about is an undercurrent theme of fear. And so what I'm asking both of you to speak to is that theme of fear and how white supremacy is used as a form of social control across the board, from racism, sexism, homophobia, education, religion, etc. The undertone of all those isms and ideologies has all been fear. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like much more of a social control, of kind of a disciplining thing for the masses, is a way of keeping everyone in line. Does that make sense?
I often say to people, you know, many of us learned growing up, perfect love casts out fear, but we didn't learn the second line, because fear had torment. And so what we're really dealing with, and I think that's what John is speaking to about whiteness even, that we are a nation in torment. I mean, that the thing about addiction that's so amazing is that it's the great equalizer. It cuts across race, class, sexual identity, preference, what have you, and that so much of our culture of addiction comes out of that torment and the inability of people to deal with the torment or the anguish, because we may not even know where the torment and the anguish is coming from, because our desires are so manipulated. We don't even know. You know, I remember, I will never forget, I'm standing up before my class at Yale, and in the back of my head, I'm hearing this little ditty, you never look so good. And I'm thinking, what the hell is that? And I went around asking people, have you heard that ditty? Have you heard that song? And it turned out, it was a Revlon commercial. But that was the end of me and TV, because I realized that had imprinted itself on my brain without me having any conscious awareness, and that I could be in the midst of lecturing 100 students, and there it could be playing itself. And that's the world we live in, and it is the world that produces that fear you're talking about, because so much is happening to us that we don't know why it's happening, where it's coming from.
Yeah,
I give him the last
the
word.
only thing I'd add is that fear, and I also add anxiety. So fear is when you know what you feel. Anxiety is when you don't know what you feel. Anxiety is part of the human condition. And there are deep anxieties. And Freud thought that the deep anxiety, after he got over sex, was death. And what Buddhists say is the deep anxiety is that we don't have, the self is not a thing. But it drives us. And to actually, so part of the spiritual practice is relaxing into that. And it's not that it won't go away. And it also gives us the capacity to actually connect with other people. All people suffer. And so the idea of, again, a life without suffering is not a real life. But how do you actually not run away from that? And there's a great line in the book called Denial of Death by a guy who got a Nobel Prize for it. He talks about immortality projects. We have these projects to try to keep death at bay. And as the famous American philosophers, Richard Pryor said, nobody gets out of life alive. So it actually it creates a common human thread. And so I think, again, not to actually make fear the problem. What it is that we have fear, we're afraid of it, we're afraid of fear, we're afraid of anxiety, and then it gets used against us, as opposed to turning around and saying, we have this part of the human condition, how do we use that to actually suffer with, which is what compassion is, to suffer with.
Courage, compassion, connection. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Bill.
Come back to you.
y'all books. That really, Linda, thank you. I know. For pulling this together. This was a wonderful event, and it is the beginning of conversations. It's not the end. So now you've been in the space, you know where we are, so when you get a note or an email from us and we say we're talking race, you know to come running, right? So once again, thank you, Dr. Powell. Thank you, Dr. Bell. And thank you, Dr. Lee.